Well, good morning, everybody. Happy Thursday, January 22nd, 2026. Thank you for joining me here, wherever you are watching TikTok, YouTube, Rumble, Twitch, all those above. Welcome. Thank you for being here. If you are here watching, I do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join me this morning. So, today I've got some kind of odd news, but good news, maybe, possibly. We'll see what happens. The reason why I say that is, past few weeks we've been talking a little bit about the affordability gap that we see in the real estate industry and what that looks like. And yesterday in Davos, Trump actually pushed for a lot of different initiatives in the housing sector. You've seen, if you've watched any of my videos, my live streams, my posts, my shorts, all those type of things, you'll notice I've mentioned a few things that he has floated out there. Well, today we're going to talk about some of the things that he's actually really pushing for and some of the executive orders and stuff that he has actually done and what is coming. So today will be a good conversation. This will be the final live stream of this week. And I'll pick back up on Monday. But thank you for being here. Before I get started into the show, though, every morning I read my Bible and I do a little bit of a Bible study. And I've mentioned this before, is one of the things that I read almost every single time and every day is Proverbs. There's one chapter for every day of the month. So I always read that. I have for many, many years. Today, I wanted to share the very first verse in chapter 22 because I do think it's wisdom for us. It's wisdom for real estate agents and people in general. It's got many life applications to it. And it comes down to the core about what I truly believe real estate agents are to do, and not get caught up in the trap of trying to keep up with what everybody else is doing and being loud and trying to get all the attention and making it about them versus making it about the person they serve. So this is Proverbs 22 verse 1, and it's very short. It says this: a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver or gold. A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches. It's very, very easy to fall into the temptation that we want to do everything we possibly can to make a dollar. We want to try to push deals and try to push closings and those type of things in our industry. It is extremely common that that's what we begin to see. But the reality, though, is that looks bad on you. That puts you into a position where you become the central focus of the transaction and it takes away from the actual individual. And it causes you to make bad decisions sometimes. The whole reason, as real estate agents, we have a code of ethics as a realtor. The reason why we have a code of ethics is because agents at some point in the past has violated or taken the initiative on themselves to do what they want to do and better themselves over the client. So we have these code of ethics in place. So that proverb is a great reminder that we don't do this just for selfish gain. I would rather have integrity, humility, honesty, all those things coming from me and what people think of me versus just trying to make another quick sale. So I think that goes down to the core about why I do what I'm doing now, my belief in what this industry is really about. And you hear me talk about it all the time. It's not about me metrics. In other words, look at me, look how great I am. It's about the client and serving them well, giving them great service, great value, and protecting them ultimately throughout the whole transaction. And then that leads to more referrals, which is what grows this industry. And that's what's going to grow your business. So I just truly believe that that is the way you grow a long lasting real estate business. So I just wanted to start off with that just to kind of get our minds thinking today before we get started on the show. Thank you guys for being here. Do appreciate it. Thank you for joining me. So let me go ahead and get started because today we're going to talk about kind of like what I said about Trump pushing some initiative about home affordability. I'm also going to talk about NAR, National Association of Realtors economist Lawrence Yun. He basically makes a statement where that we are nowhere near a recession. That a recession is not really what's in the cards right now. If you look at the data, that's not what we're looking at. And then I'm going to share an article from nationalmortgageprofessional.com. And in that article, it's going to talk about monthly housing costs fall 5.5% as rates dip to 3-year low. So today is going to be very much market heavy. Yesterday was more agent centric. We focused more on giving you guys tools, action items, and stuff to implement into your business to help you grow. That was my point of yesterday's show. Today, to end the week, I want to go and just kind of do a big snapshot about the economy because going into a weekend, that's typically what comes up. How's the market? These type of things. So hopefully you guys are staying safe though too. If you're anywhere near this belt of snow and ice and everything else that's going on, let me know in the chat. We'll be saying a prayer for you guys because it's who knows? It could be nothing, but it could also be a whole lot. And I think the ice is that's the concern, right? Ice is so dangerous. Matter of fact, we went out and bought a generator yesterday just in case we get ice and get more and more prepared for it. And also for food, I put a pork butt in the smoker today to kind of get that smoking, and so we have meat and food. So anyway, just take precautions. Be ready for this storm that's coming, and just use wisdom. Use wisdom. So, all right. Well, with all that being said, thank you for being here, like I said, and let's go ahead and just get started into the show today and go through some news articles and talk about the market. So, welcome to the Real Estate Brief. I'm Adam, and today I'm cutting through a lot of the noise that you find inside of the headlines in the real estate industry. We're going to get to the truth that we find inside of the news, not just take the hype and what it says at its face value, but we're going to look at the data. And I'm going to give you some of my own observations in regards to what I think is an advantage inside of every type of story, which I truly believe that there is. I don't think any negative story, there's a positive, there's some kind of advantage that we can take from that. So I believe we can find those opportunities by reading through these and taking our time and dissecting them and talking to them together. So if you're ready to gain your real estate edge, let's dive into our very first story of the day. And this is the featured story, right? This is the one that everybody's kind of talking about. And this is probably going to be in the news and the headlines and everything else. And so it makes sense that we would talk about that right here, right? All right. So here's what's happened. President Trump has actually signed a major executive order yesterday, and it's aimed at barring large institutional investors from buying single family homes. Now, while those headlines are filled with all kinds of Wall Street, big executives buying and Wall Street versus families and that kind of hype involved, we need to take a step back and look at whether this actually moves the needle on inventory or the affordability gap and what that actually looks like. So let's go ahead and I'm going to share my screen and we're going to walk through. Let me see here. There we go. Get that switched over. There we go. Everything's synced over. Okay. So this is the very first article. This is by Associated Press, apnews.com. It's on their business category by Alex Viga, something like that. It was posted yesterday at 3:51 p.m. Just to give you a framework about how recent this is. And this all just kind of happened yesterday, actually. So it says this: President Trump's plans for bringing homeownership within reach of more Americans involve pushing for lower interest rates on home loans and credit cards and banning large institutional investors from buying single family homes. In his address Wednesday at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Trump outlined 4 policies his administration is pursuing in a bid to make home ownership more affordable. Each had been previously mentioned by him or his administration in recent weeks, part of a broader push to address affordability generally, a hot button issue with voters heading into the midterms. So let's just stop for just 1 second and let's just talk about what this actually means. What does this mean? Hold on just 1 second. Sorry, it looks like there we go. I think TikTok is giving me a flag here to let me know that I can't share certain things. So, but here's we need to pause for just a second, and we need to talk about exactly what's going on. And there's 2 things really, right? There's the political side of it, and then there's the reality of the housing market and where we find ourselves. So there's 2 things kind of happening here. One is, yes, we are going into the midterm, so it makes sense that in the political world that there is some posturing happening to make things happen, and they need to boister their position in their party to make themselves look good. So going into midterms, they can help increase their election results, right? So that's one argument. That's a fair argument. That's typically what happens. Democrat, Republican, doesn't really matter. That's what happens, right? Whoever's controlling whoever's president, they've got to make things happen so the voters there can see that their lives are improving under that leadership, and then that leads to them voting for them again, right? So that's the game they're playing on the political front. The other side of the aisle, though, and the other side of the conversation is actually talking more about what it means to address this affordability gap that we're finding in the housing industry. And that's the ultimate challenge here. So, when you start trying to balance economies, it's very, very difficult. It's not so straightforward. If you make an adjustment over here, it could have major effects over here. But this side might look good, and this side gets affected. So it's a constant teeter-tottering of doing these things. What I will say is I appreciate any president, regardless of party, taking some initiative and paying attention to what's going out there and being strategic in this. And what we have noticed over the past few weeks is that Trump has floated many, 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 many different informations out there, a lot of different scenarios and different ideas. He's thrown out 50-year mortgages. He's thrown out banning the large institutions from buying residential homes, all kinds of different things. The Fed's buying up from Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae buying up some bonds from banks and stuff like that to free up more cash in the market. All of those things are in the conversation. So that's what's happening here. That's the conversation. So we got the political side of it, yes, but then we have certain things that this political party is trying to do to then address this thing and make it more affordable for the everyday person. So for that, we need to pay attention and see if what's going to happen inside of this article actually makes sense, right? So let's keep going down. It says in his address Wednesday. Okay, yeah. So let's go ahead and jump down here. In his remarks, Trump stressed the need to lower interest rates on home loans and credit cards in order to give aspiring home buyers more financial flexibility to save up for a down payment on a home and more purchasing power when it comes time to buy. It says we can drop interest rates to a level, and that's one thing we do want to do, said Trump. That's natural. That's good for everybody, The dropping of interest rate, we should be paying a much lower interest rate than we are. So he's making all kinds of pushes for this kind of stuff. There's a lot of stuff going on in the market right now, and he's addressing many of these different things, right? It says still Fed rate cuts don't always translate into lower mortgage rates. We talk about this all the time, that how lowering the Fed rate does not necessarily correlate to lowering the mortgage rate, right? It doesn't go hand in hand. That's not how this works. Now, it can have long-lasting effects. It could ultimately lower the mortgage rate, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen, every single time, right? At that time, the 10-year Treasury yield was climbing toward 5%. More recently, the average rate on a 30-year mortgage was at 6.06 last week, its lowest level in more than 3 years, according to mortgage buyer Freddie Mac. All right. To that end, Trump said he is asking Congress for legislation that would mandate credit card issuers cap interest rates at 10% for 1 year after the industry ignored his demand earlier this month, that they implement the cap by January 20th. The average rate on credit cards is around 21%. So he's making a push here to try to cap the credit cards around 10%, right? He's trying to get it to where people can pay off those credit card debt a little bit quicker, pay off not pay as much in interest, and pay the principal down. So that's the argument he's trying to do here. Look, it's a teeter-tottering thing, right? Pouring more money into the market and freeing up more cash could cause more inflation. But at the same time, by doing that, the affordability and gap would decrease in the ability for someone to buy a home because their outgo has been limited, right? So they're getting more out of debt, so therefore they can roll it over into something else, right? So that's the balancing act here that we see going on, right? That's what we're trying to see. That's what's trying to happen here. Okay, Trump also reiterated that he wants to block large institutional investors from buying single-family homes, so the Americans don't have to compete with such well-funded rivals when they shop for a home. Homes are built for people, not for corporations. He said that a few weeks ago. He says, while touting his plans to open up the housing market to more Americans, Trump stressed that he didn't want to take any action that would tip the housing market too far in favor of buyers at the expense of millions of homeowners who have benefited from a strong home equity gains. So this is the point, right? This is the whole difficult thing about this whole process is you are trying to figure out how to adjust one thing without causing another one just to go crazy, right? It's a very difficult thing to balance, but you have to do something. You have to be responsive to the market. When you see a discrepancy between buyers and sellers, you have to address it. If you can do it from a federal side and let it trickle down from there or through regulations, then that's a good move. But the reality is, if when you make a change, it's going to affect something else. And what are the ramifications of that? Who knows? So there's an argument to be had here. And so that's another thing that he is doing, right? He's talking about that as well. So let me just pause here and let's just, before I get into the next couple articles all about this, there is really just two major things that he's talking about here. One's the credit card thing, and the other one is about large institutions. And then there's another one that's a third one that we'll get into in just a second, talking about buying up some bonds and freeing up some cash in the market. These are all good, but here's the thing. A lot of economists are even saying in regards to like the large institutions coming in and buying up homes. Now, I had a whole video about this, and overall, in my opinion, would be that this is actually a good thing. I think having large institutions banned from buying private residential homes up in subdivisions is a good thing overall. The reality, though, is it's not going to change the needle too much because right now they only own 1 to 3% of the actual property, private residential homes in America. So by doing this, you're not really teetering that too far in one direction. But then I pose a question to you: does that actually matter? Do you not address something just because it's not a big impact? Because there's also an emotional factor to that as well. Even that little impact does affect it to the good for the everyday consumer. So maybe addressing this is a good idea, right? To bring more balancing to the market. And then if you don't address that and it begins to take off and you see more and more large investors going into the residential area and they see the viability of buying more properties, then you end up having a much larger problem. So do you wait until you have a larger problem to address it? Or do you see the writing on the wall that, hey, it's like, maybe this is like a red flag for us to pay attention. Maybe this is not a good idea. So having this conversation to me is a good conversation to have overall. All right. So the next one here is by Reuters. This is by Reuters. It says Trump signs order to limit Wall Street investors in single family housing. So it goes on. And in summary of this says this: Trump says he aims to boost home ownership, restrict federal sales to investors. DOJ FTC to review investor acquisitions for anti-competitive practices, and institutional investors own 3% of single-family rentals. So it says this: U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order on Tuesday to restrict large institutional investors from competing with individual home buyers in an effort to make housing more affordable, the White House said. All right, so we just hammered this all the way out. What does this mean, though? There's still some details that we don't really know. What is a large institution? What qualifies that? How do we regulate this, and what does this look like as we go forward, right? It says Trump's order on Tuesday directs his administration to promote home sales to individual buyers, restrict federal programs from facilitating sales of single family homes to Wall Street investors, and review acquisitions by large investors. DOJ and FTC to review large deals. The Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission will review acquisitions by large investors for anti competitive practices and prioritize enforcement against certain of those practices by institutional investors in the single family home rental market. All right, so that's what they're going to be doing. They're tasked with reviewing and seeing what's going on with these large institutions. How much of this is actually a large institution buying, or is it a private investor buying up homes? So their DOJ and FTC is going to be analyzing this as they go forward, right? That's what we're saying here. So that's one answer to the question: is like, how are they going to regulate this? What does this actually look like? It goes on to say here, it says by June 2022, institutional investors owned around 450,000 homes, or about 3% of all single family rental homes nationally, according to a 2024 study by the Government Accountability. So we're looking at 3%, right? It's not a huge percentage, but you're also talking about 450,000 homes that are owned by these institutions that are not owned by individuals or even landlords that are local and live in those areas. And I have a whole nother video on this that talks about this in more depth, about the risk and the consequences of big, large institutions going in and buying up big swaths of private residential homes and what that actually does to the market. There is an effect there. We can't just ignore this. I've heard one economist say, like, look, it's all noise. We don't really need to be paying attention to this. It's not that big of a number. And sure, he's right when you look at the data. When you look at just the data, that's fine. You would say, yeah, really, it's not going to move the pendulum too much on the actual data, right? But there's two factors. One is the emotional state of man. Right? We are emotional creatures. So when we hear news like this about banning and this kind of stuff, it spurs creativity. It spurs emotion in investors to say, hey, there may be some opportunity out there for me to now invest and buy up properties and be a good landlord and spur them into the market, right? Someone that lives locally, that takes care and nurtures the property better than a large institution that is not local, takes care of the tenant, understands the person, knows the person, right? That's statistically what we see is those landlords care about their tenant. They are also less likely to raise the rent on those tenants. So in some ways, this is a great way to protect that landlord-tenant relationship from being a corporate type entity, right? And also gives the ability for the buyers in that market to go in and buy property and not be competing with an all-cash buyer that can really just throw money at it because they're going to make the money in the long game, right? That the local buyer cannot do. So that's the thing. Like, this is something we need to be paying attention to, that we can't ignore this as a fact, that these little micro changes, even though it's only a 3% change, it can still be a drastic change. So let's keep that in mind. All right. So the final one in regards to this topic, this one is by Time Magazine, by Connor Green. The title says Trump is moving to bar Wall Street firms from buying single family homes. Here's what that would mean for affordability. So we're going to skip down. I think I saw a quote. Yeah. It's a quote. Hardworking young families cannot effectively compete for starter homes with Wall Street firms and their vast resources, the order reads. Neighborhoods and communities once controlled by middle class American families are now run by faraway corporate interests. My administration will take decisive action to stop Wall Street from treating American neighborhoods like a trading floor and empower American families to own their homes. So that's what we're talking about, right? That's the whole argument here. You can disagree, agree, whatever. I think there's some validity to what he is saying. How big of a number and how big of a change does this actually do? We'll see what happens. I don't think it's going to be anything super drastic. I really do not think so. Again, it's just a small amount of people, but it doesn't mean you ignore it. It's still a factor. What does Trump's order do? The order directs agencies to promote home sales to individual buyers and restrict federal programs from enabling big investors to acquire single family homes by approving, insuring, guaranteeing, securitizing, or facilitating such sales. The order also instructs the Treasury Secretary to consider revising rules and guidance related to large institutional investors acquiring single family homes and directs the Attorney General and Federal Trade Commission to review such investors' acquisitions. So they're laying the framework now for us to understand what this means, right? This is where it's coming out. Like, okay, so this is how this is going to translate. This is how it's going to affect us. This is how it's going to trickle down. This is what it could mean, right? What will the order mean for housing prices? His research has shown that roughly 1% of the entire single family housing stock is owned by big investors. Only 1%, guys. It's not a very big percentage at all. About 11% by smaller mom and pop shop investors and 87% by individuals. See, very small percentage. Peter defines large institutional investors as those acquiring hundreds of homes at a time. Okay, so there's some clarifying context. What is a large one? It is somebody going in and buying a swath of homes, hundreds of homes at one time, right? Multiple units in one go. It says another tally from 2023 Urban Institute report estimated that institutional investors owned about 3.8% of single family rental homes nationally by June 2022. So it's going up just a little bit, right? All right, let's see if there's anything else we want to hammer out this. I don't think there is. I think that you kind of get the idea about what we're doing here. This is what's going to be in the news. This is what you're going to be hearing about probably in the next few news cycles, probably over the next week or so. You're going to be talking about how Trump's banned, large institutions. You're going to have pros and cons on both things. The reality is this, is when I read articles like this, I read the data, I go back and I assess what I know about my local market, and I make my own decisions based upon what I see in my own local data. And if I'm in a market that has a lot of large institutional investors, well, I would say you might see a benefit from this. If you're in an area where you don't see any of this happening, then guess what? It doesn't change anything that happens locally because real estate is local, right? So if you have them in your area, then guess what? You're going to see results from this. If you do not, you're not going to see much from this, right? So that's just the reality. All right. So let me give you some just observations here, some takeaways, and some things you maybe can do to even just knowing, even if it's not in your area and affecting anything you do, just know that you're going to have buyers and sellers that are reading the news and they're not going to fully understand what this is, right? So we need to kind of have talking points to answer the question, how's the market and what does this ban mean, right? So let's talk about that, right? So if I was sitting down and doing a buyer consultation and I'm handling an objection, I would be very prepared to de-escalate any kind of fear that might be coming from the other person talking about how this is happening. And it can come from either side, right? One side can say, can you imagine these large institutions buying up this property? It's so bad. It's so horrible and all this kind of stuff, right? And then they champion the Trump cause and they champion this and they are rooted in that. The other side of the aisle is like, I can't believe that he's Trump, he's coming down on this type of market. He's coming against capitalism and this is what we want to see happen. I don't understand how has the right to ban. And so you have these, tug of war thing going on, right? So no matter what the conversation is, you got to have a response to that. And here's what I would lean into the truth, right? I would use that 1 to 3% ownership stat. I would simply tell them is like, yeah, look, there's reason to have concern for certain scenarios, and there's reason this is good. But the reality is we're only looking at a 1 to 3% ownership statistic of these Wall Street's big institutions taking everything, right? So if we want to buy into the idea and the hype that they're taking everything, we have to go back to the data. And the reality is they own a very small percentage of the market. Now, I don't want to discredit those that see, the Wall Street as just a horrible entity and that kind of stuff and say, well, this, I can't believe they're doing this. I would simply just reiterate to them, it's like, really, in the end, it's okay to monitor this, put restrictions on this so it doesn't go too crazy over time, right? To bring some balance back to it and give local owners an opportunity to come in and buy a property, right? I would then lean into under helping your communities understand the cost that is associated with buying a house. I'd pivot the conversation from Wall Street to local inventory and supply demand metrics that are local to you. So instead of like focusing on all the news and headlines, bring to your consultations and your conversations actual data about what's happening in your local market. If they're worried about this and you don't have any large institutions buying property, just simply tell them it's like, yeah, I understand that's a concern in some places, but here we don't have any large institutions. And then if you're are in an area, then bring the data to say, yeah, we do have those type of buyers here, and that is a real concern, and there is effect to that. But they only own XYZ of the market, so it's not even a large amount. So just know that is how that works, right? All right. So let me now. It's not going to be a long stream today. It's not going to be too long at all. So this will be good. We had a long one yesterday and the day before. It was, I think, an hour and a half or something like that. Um. Well, let me actually. I've got a quote here. Let me share this. Yeah, let me share this quote. This is actually a great quote. This came from Weekly Real Estate News in my email. So look, if you go to just Google in Weekly Real Estate News, and you can sign up for a newsletter, and they send you a statement, whatever, and breaks down some of the news that's going on and that kind of stuff. And I actually got the email this morning, and there's a quote by John G. Stevens, which he is the president of Weekly Real Estate News. And I wanted to highlight this here because as a professional, okay, so as professionals, how do we approach any kind of information that we get, and especially when there's national policy that's coming out of this, right? So when there's national policy that's entering into the private sector, we need to pay attention, but we need to have a professional takeaway from this and a professional response. So here's a quote that he gave at the bottom of his email today, and I just wanted to share this. He says this: "When housing becomes a national policy issue, expectations change faster than reality. If you overpromise outcomes, you'll lose trust. If you dismiss the news, you'll sound disconnected. If you can explain what's real, what's possible, and what's political, you become invaluable. This market doesn't reward hype, it rewards clarity." There is a lot to unpack in that statement, but I would completely agree with his approach of being professional. That's the way I would approach that, right? Because when policy does become a national policy and it becomes a major issue on the national front, then what ends up happening is that expectation about what this news means happens really fast, and people start spreading it all over social media, and then it loses touch with reality because people just take the headlines and they just run with it. They just go with it. Real estate agents, you guys fall into the same trap. You hear a news article and you start sharing it everywhere, and you don't take your time to read through it. I challenge you, don't do that, because you need to be the professional in the situation. And then that's where his statement really comes to light, right? Is if you send something out and you make a statement, you make a promise about how the outcome is going to be, or you make a statement based on something you don't fully understand and you've not dissected, and you make a truth claim about it, guess what happens? When you do that, you're going to ultimately lose the trust of those you're trying to help or trying to get to use you as an agent, right? You're going to automatically lose trust the moment it doesn't happen. If that outcome doesn't happen, you've lost trust. So be very careful running with any kind of headline without knowing. So if you can explain what's real, and that's what he goes on to say, if you can explain what the article is actually saying, and you can dissect it and take your time and fully understand it, and then don't root in a scenario if you're not really 100% confident in it, but elaborate on it, see what's possible and what's political and what's true and what's not true. That's where you become, what he said, invaluable, right? Because you're not building the hype, right? He went on to say this market doesn't reward hype, it rewards clarity. So what I'm trying to do here is provide clarity to the news that's out there. do likewise. Go out and take any kind of news articles that you are reading and bring it back and bring clarity to what it means in a professional way. I think this is great advice. So John G. Stevens, well stated. That was such a great way to state what this news means and how you should read this information. So I appreciate that. Just such a great statement. All right. So now let's get into. I've got two more articles here, and we will wrap up the show. So, so this one here, this one is going to be. This is by Inman, and basically NAR, National Association of Realtors, chief economist Lawrence Yun says in this Economist that we're not really anywhere near a recession. His argument is there's plenty of hype out there. There's a lot of news articles out there. But what Yoon is actually looking at, he's looking at job growth and the overall housing demand that we see. And he sees those two items as the ultimate stabilizers in our market. So that's when we go through this article, that's what he's actually beginning to say here. He's basically saying, like, look, there's a lot of articles out there that's got a lot of hype about economic doom and all this type of stuff, right? They're trying to sell ads, right? But what he's watching is that job growth percentage and the housing demand and what those two things mean in relation to what the market's going to do. So those are two metrics that we're watching very closely, and it makes sense to do so. It makes very good sense to do so. So let me show you this article here. Oh, there it goes. It was delayed. All right. Lawrence Yun shared his economic outlook Wednesday, saying that despite volatility, the U.S. is still on track for 4 to 5% growth next quarter. Okay. It says the past 72 hours have set a shockwave through the economy as the Trump administration's volatile foreign policy stokes fear of a devalued dollar, higher consumer costs, and a recession. I don't know why it went back. Hold on. There we go. Depression that would rival that of the late 1920s and 30s. In his latest webinar with the Travelers Institute, the National Association of Realtors chief economist Lawrence Yun attempted to alleviate agent fears. And to do that, he offered a tempered review of mortgage rates, buyer and seller sentiment, near-term home sales trends, and home market health. He also weighed in on whether several recent stock market dips are the precursor to something much worse. Hint, it's not, and at least for now. All right. So his statement here, his quote, Lawrence Yun, he says, let's first start with the very big picture. Aside from the real estate, I think there's a question about whether or not we are going into an economic recession. Yun said, addressing the biggest elephant in the room, the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank, which tracks the gross domestic product, the GDP, number for the upcoming quarter is implying that we are not anywhere near a recession. In fact, the next quarter GDP reading could be in the 4% to 5% range. So one thing about Dr. Lawrence Yun that he always does is he goes back to the data. He's a great guy that understands that the data tells us a lot of the truth, right? He goes on to say, quote, related to real estate, flood insurance is not available. Some mortgages are not originated. Some of the rural communities which depend upon the U.S. Department of Agriculture to get a mortgage to buy a home with a zero down payment would not be available, or income verification from the Internal Revenue Service, he said. So we hope it doesn't happen. So this is his concern about the risk of another government shutdown. So he's talking about the government shutdown. So I'm bringing that back into the context there. He goes on to say it is 75% of normal meaning 2019 pre-COVID, he said. We had 2 years of frenzied activity when interest rates were low, but when the Federal Reserve aggressively raised interest rates, mortgage rates going up to 8%, you see what happens to home sales, right? So new home sales will depend upon builder activity. We talked about this a couple weeks ago or a couple of days ago about how the builder activity has been picking up and some of the incentives and stuff that's going on. So there's a lot of movement in the new built sector. There's a lot of movement going on there. So he went on to note that his underlying assumption is that mortgage rates will be hovering near 6%. So there's an emotional factor here, right? So people are going to get more comfortable with understanding that that's where we're going to stay within a percentage of interest rate. So that's the whole argument. And that brings an emotional stability to the market. Some weeks 5.8%, other times 6.3%, but essentially 6% average. Job gains, not spectacular, but not recession. There are job gains happening across the board. He says, as for a broader economy, Yoon said he's keeping his eye on artificial intelligence and whether the major players, NVIDIA, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Facebook, et cetera, will be able to turn consumer fascination into profit. We'll see what happens there. So Dr. Lawrence Yun gave us some great insight on what that looks like. Um, there we go. My software is kind of freezing up. So he gives some great points, right? So he really points out to what we see as like a more of a steady employment as one of the main reasons why a recession is probably very unlikely, at least in the immediate future, right? So if we're seeing growth in the employment side, that does not imply a recession necessarily, right? So that's what we're looking at. Then there's also an inventory lag that's going on. So we do know that we do know that sales volume is actually low, but the lack of inventory that we have in the market right now, that actually prevents the prices that we usually see in a typical crash. So if we look back at any other previous crashes, we would typically see the opposite of that. So again, that volume is a factor. So since we don't see that, then that's an issue. But then we also come to another point that he made in this is there's a pent up demand that happens where we have thousands of buyers that are really just waiting on the sidelines for any sign of what he's calling like a rate stability. In other words, creating kind of like a floor in the market. Rate stability comes when that rate doesn't fluctuate drastically one way or the other. The stability comes from the emotional perception of the buyer. And when they feel like their market is more stabilized, they're more likely to settle in and make a purchase. So, given that that's what we're seeing, and we're seeing that lower interest rate, again, that's why he's making the argument that a recession is not necessarily what is in the cards. Okay. Now, some takeaway items, what I would say if I was a real estate agent, I was going to extract something out of this, I was going to use it in my everyday business. What I would do is I would take and go local, find your unemployment data, find out what that looks like. And if that data shows that there's an increase in employment, that will be able to, when you sit down and do a consultation with a buyer or seller and they start worrying about stuff, or you're having conversation with the general public, or you're making posts on social media, that kind of data where you see the unemployment rate maybe going down and employment rate going up, that proves that there is more of an economic stability that's actually taken place. And that should help calm the consumers that you're leading. So I would get very good at understanding the data and maybe tailoring some social media posts and some videos and talking to clients and stuff like that about that. I would then lean into understanding what Lawrence, we didn't talk about this, but he goes on to talk about what a floor effect is. And basically, you hit a floor. The amount of inventory we have and then the amount of job growth and buyer activity and the pent-up demand creates a floor. And when you think of a floor, think of like a steady place to walk upon, right? So it's a stability type idea. So that tells you that 2008 style crash that we had back then is probably highly unlikely given the makeup that we're currently in. Now, I'm using Dr. Lawrence Yun here as kind of my major anchor point, but a lot of other economists are in agreement with this. They're not seeing it in the cards that there's a high probability of a crash at all. Now, what I would also advise, I would say, look, if you're a real estate agent out there and you're trying to get into getting more listings and those type of things, there is a focus that you need to see, that you need to focus on what I guess you could say like the necessity sellers, right? The ones that by necessity have to sell. So who are those? Well, those are people that are looking that moving because they have to. They are moving because their job, right? So you want to figure out your data, look at the data and find out where jobs are and where people are moving out of your area for those jobs and target them. People are having drastic family changes in their lives, right? They got kids growing up, maybe they're wanting to downsize, maybe the opposite, they're increasing their family size and they need a bigger home. Like, pay attention to these things. If you have a core group, and this is why I lean really heavy into a contact resource, a relationship management software, is having everybody inside of that database keeping very good notes on your clients and your leads and your consumers about their kids and family and what's going on, and follow them on Facebook and social media and keeping tabs on them, because you can find inside of that the necessity sellers. Now, there is a lot of AI at work doing this kind of stuff in the back end with some CRMs. Now, we're kind of the very beginning stages of all this, but I do see that kind of coming as the time goes forward. So be watching, be paying attention, but find those necessity sellers. That's your opportunity. It really, really is. That's where it's at, because they are the ones that are going to be putting their house on the market. That's where the agents are going to win. All right, I got one more article and then we'll wrap up this show for the day and for the week. So thank you guys for being here. I do appreciate it. If you're finding any kind of value here, please consider subscribing, liking, and following, doing all those type of things. Do greatly appreciate it. And thank you for taking the time out to watch me talk and break down the news. All right. So here is story number. I guess this is number 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 5 for the day. This one's coming from the National Mortgage Professional, professional.com page. It was posted January 19th of 2026. It's by them. That doesn't name an author. I was going to give them a shout out here. I don't see that. It's basically them. So the title of this is Monthly Housing Costs Fall 5.5% as Rates Dip to 3-year Low. What we're going to see inside of this article here is we're going to see that what's happened when you lower the interest rate. We're going to see that the monthly housing costs have seen really their largest drop in over a year because of the mortgage rates that hit pretty much a 3-year low. And we even had one point where it hit 5.99 for just a little bit. But that spurred the housing cost to drop considerably. So that makes that affordability window shrink down just a little bit, and that gap. And this is what we've been waiting for. This is the moment that now, if you are a buyer on the fence or a seller on the fence, it's your opportunity on both sides to get your home on the market and get it sold, and for a buyer to get in there and buy it. But there's a window. And how long will this window last, right? So that's the question. But right now is that window. This is that convergence here where everything's happening. And it's almost like the perfect storm. That going into this spring, it's like the perfect storm to get it on the market and get your home sold, and for a buyer to get out there and start buying a house, right? My dog's going crazy. All right, so let's get into this article here. Falling mortgage rates have driven the largest year-over-year drop in monthly housing costs in more than a year, boosting buyer affordability even as market activity remains muted. So here's the data, right? This is what they argue. This is their opinion, and this is what the data says, okay? U.S. monthly housing costs have declined sharply, offering prospective homebuyers notable relief as mortgage rates recede, according to a new housing market report from Redfin. The median monthly housing payment fell to $2,413 during the 4 weeks ending January 11th, marking a 5.5% decrease year over year, marking the largest drop in more than a year. So we're looking at a 5.5% drop in cost of ownership. It doesn't seem like a lot, but when you factor in a 30-year loan, that's significant. That's a lot more equity being paid off. So if somebody financed a house or bought a house back in 2022 and 2023, chances are they bought around a 7% interest rate, somewhere in that realm. It would make sense for that buyer to go back and refinance. Or if that buyer has had life circumstances, going back to what I was saying, the necessity sellers, if that buyer of yours in the past is now needing to be a seller because of necessity reasons, job, family, those type of things, then this is an opportunity for you that kept good records to reach back out to your clients and the buyers and say, hey, just so you know, I noticed that you bought a house in 2022 and 2023. I think your interest rate is still right around the 7%. It might make more sense for you to talk to a lender and you let them quote you to see what your refinancing your payment would be and what that looks like. And at the same time, that leads you into a conversation to have with them in regards to actually converting that into a listing, right? Because maybe they don't even realize that they're not locked in as much as they thought they were, right? So that's the whole point. Redfin's report attributes the decline primarily to a recent fall in mortgage interest rates. The daily average rate for a 30-year fixed rate mortgage dipped to 5.99, the lowest level in nearly 3 years, while the rate has since edged up slightly to about 6.07. All right, so that's what we're seeing it. Let's jump on down to right here. However, the housing market's activity remains subdued. Pending home sales declined roughly 5% year over year, and new listings dropped nearly 4.7%, suggesting that buyers and sellers' cautious outlook persists despite cost relief. Now, slightly negative there, but let me just summarize kind of this article in my own words, and then talk kind of about the opportunities that I see in this kind of data. Okay. Now, I'm not any kind of fortune teller or telling you exactly what's going to happen, but I monitor these kind of stuff and I read these numbers and I run math. This is just the way my brain works. So I like this kind of stuff. So here's the thing. We do know one thing. We know that the median monthly payments fell to what? $2,413. And we know that is a 5.5% year over year drop. Okay. So now that affordability marker has dropped just a little bit. All right. So now what we know is that rate dip, that rate that it touched at 5.9 that just immediately happened, that increased the purchasing power by roughly, and here's the thing, $30,000 over the last 6 months. See, that's the key thing is when you start talking about a rate drop like that, that means the purchasing power went up $30,000 of that buyer. Okay. Because if I had to go in and I had my debt to income ratio and the lender's looking at me and they see a 7% rate versus a 6% rate and they do the math, I'm looking at a $30,000 better buying power as a buyer. So that means there's a $30,000 catch up to what we would call inflation and that affordability gap from where the homes are to where the buyer can afford. That $30,000 is a lot of money, right? So now what we know is we do know that there is an inventory strain. Okay. So we do know there are still sellers that are sitting on the fence that are not putting their house on the market. And that's causing a problem with the inventory still. So even despite all these lower costs, we do know, and the data said this in the article, it says new listings are down what? 4.7%, right? 4.7%, meaning the deals are being fought over by what? More buyers. So if you are a seller and you're listening to this, if you are an agent, if you've got sellers on the fence, you've got a buyer pool that has more buying power with a lower interest rate. You see the opportunity here? It's time to sell, right? Because right now is where we leverage the emotion of the buyer to bring them into the market to then buy a house. That's where their minds are at. For the first time in a few years, the news is saying now's the time to buy because the interest rates are lower than they have been in many years. That spurs the buyer on. But then yet we have this inventory problem. So sellers, if you're on the fence, sell. It's time to sell. We're not going to see these low interest rates anymore. If you need to sell and you are what I would call a necessity seller, this is your window. Get it on the market. Don't even wait for spring. Get it on the market right now. Agents, if you're listening, hopefully you're listening to this. Call anybody that you've talked to in the past couple months about wanting to sell and tell them, don't wait until spring. Let's get your house on the market right now. Let's get it out there. Let's build this inventory back up. Let's get it in front of as many buyers as we possibly can while the emotions are very high in the buyer field, right? Then I would also take this information. Now, here's my action items. These are what I would say, hey, go out here and do these things, right? I would begin to build a rent versus buy scenario based on 5.9 to 6.1% range of interest rates compared to 7 and show them what the affordability now is, and then take what they're paying per rent for per month where they're not getting equity in anything. And I would go and talk to tenants. I would go out and I would begin talking to them and showing them the affordability and what this looks like based on what their rent is and help them to start building wealth now because they need to be thinking this way. So I'd figure out some kind of campaign to reach out to renters right now. I absolutely would do that. I would then highlight to any past clients, anybody that's on the fence, any seller that's going on there about the $30,000 increase in the purchasing power of a buyer right now. That is a great conversation starter. That is a great way to begin an entire conversation with all clients and also on social media. Start talking about this because that is database re-engagement. That gives you a reason to reach out to everybody in your database and re-engage with them with actual data about what this market actually means. It's not just a percent drop. It's a $30,000 increase in purchasing power of the buyer, right? That works for the buyer and the seller's good, right? And going back to what I just said, I would advise sellers to list now while the buyers have this sudden surge in affordability. Don't wait. Right? I would send out personalized video text to any buyer who paused their search when rates were at, 6.5, 7, or whatever it was, and tell them to get involved and be engaged and let's go. That this is the time to buy. Your purchase power just went up to $30,000. Do you want to see what that gets you in today's market before the spring rush? Ask them that, right? Ask them that question because I think they're going to be able to get a whole lot more than they've ever thought they could. So there you go, guys. That's my takeaways from these news articles today. I do appreciate you guys for being here. Man, thank you so much. I will be posting a video tomorrow. I've been editing that and getting it ready. It's talking about, and this is a really sad statistic. Basically, the video is going to be about how 87% of real estate agents that have been in this industry for 5 years fail. 87%, and only 13% make it after 5 years in real estate. I've been thinking about that statistic all week, and I decided yesterday to record a video talking about my observations about why I think that is. And to be honest, I think a lot of the reason why there's such a high failure rate is people get into this thinking it as a hobby. They see all the fun videos and social media posts that real estate agents do out there, and they look at this job as just a fun, exciting, and freeing and just a great easy job because the image that is portrayed makes it look that way. But then what they don't realize that they treat it as like kind of like a hobby in a way, but what they don't realize is they're actually getting in this business and doing a startup. And that, yeah, there's a lot of videos out there of a lot of agents having fun. You're not seeing the sweat, blood, and tears from those agents that got them there. You're not seeing that. So there's a perception out there, and it's perpetuated by a lot of agents, to be honest, and even a lot of brokers and a lot of recruiters out there that talk about how great everything is. Now, don't get me wrong. I love real estate. I've been doing this for many, many years, and I love the industry. And I do think those that want to work it can make a great living and have great success in it. But the reality is, it's not easy. It takes a whole lot of work. And anybody listening knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's very, very difficult. So, knowing that going into it prepares you to make decisions differently than thinking of it as a hobby. So, in that video, I'm going to lay out many other reasons why I think this is the case. But I'm saying it now to kind of begin to frame our minds like we need to be teaching other agents how to think like business owners and CEOs and not all the hype. That's where we need to really be leaning into. So, anyway, check that video out. It'll post tomorrow evening at 9 p.m. So, I do appreciate you guys being here. That is your real estate brief for today, as well as for this entire week. That wraps everything up. So, here's the thing. If you found this helpful, would you please consider hitting that like button, following, subscribing, all those things, which would help the algorithm to know that you would like more of this content, not just me, but other content that helps you in your real estate business. So it does help that entire algorithm. And also, would you consider if you have somebody that's a coworker or anything like that could benefit from this type of information and this kind of show to build a community here, please feel free to share this video with them and invite them to join us here. I go live Monday through Thursday, 8:30 a.m. Eastern time, roughly about 1 hour. And then I post throughout the week as well on the channel as well. So please consider sharing this and letting other people know. All right. I do appreciate that. I am focused on helping agents build a business that is built on relationship focused first. That's my entire goal here. And look, there is so much more that I could be saying right now, but it's time to go. See you guys next week. Stay safe out there and stay warm. See ya.